Today, the word Gothic conjures up images of horror, of vampires and grotesques, evil spectres and vulnerable heroines. Gothic novels inspired cinema, creating a popular culture of nightmares, where monsters lurk in the shadows, ready to wreak destruction. But there's an altogether earlier Gothic world, a sacred world of great cathedrals and churches, built in the architectural style we call medieval Gothic. Gothic architecture arrived in England 800 years ago. It was a style of building that took risks, ever taller, brilliant engineering in stone, that used pointed arches rather than round ones, intricate tracery and huge stained glass windows, a new and agile architecture of dazzling light. But the Gothic sensibility shaped more than buildings. It was a world picture that shaped man's understanding of God in the heavens above, humanity below, and the day of reckoning never far away. It was a way of making sense of the world, embracing both the spiritual and the secular. It seems to represent stability, continuity, and yet the Gothic period was one of the most turbulent in English history. A time of civil war, the assassination of kings, and the Black Death. Plague would wipe out a third of the population of Christendom and decimate England. And yet, the Gothic Revolution would reach new heights, especially here in Britain. It would become a national style, eclipsing the rest of Europe, and create a new sense of English nationhood and patriotism. Gothic art and architecture would transform medieval England from a European backwater into a world leader of style and power. '11th century England was a dangerous and oppressive place. After his victory at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, William the Conqueror and his Norman barons built castles to subjugate the Anglo-Saxon population of England. Formidable and overbearing, this was an architecture of conquest. Known as Romanesque because its swagger harked back to the days of the Roman Empire, walls were thick, arches were round, and windows almost an afterthought. And the churches and the cathedrals they built were just as oppressive. This truly was an architecture you couldn't argue with. When you come inside a Norman cathedral, there are the same Romanesque characteristics. The small windows, the rounded arches and the massive columns made of pre-cut stones or cylinders placed one on top of the other and then filled with rubble. They go up very quickly, and through their sheer bulk, they act as an expression of Norman supremacy. But with the Norman invasion came a wave of new clerics. They would take over the church in England. None was more powerful than Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury. Born in Lombardy, he rose to power in England, in spite of frequent quarrels with the Norman kings. He was a theologian and philosopher who dared to question religious orthodoxy. The early medieval world had seen mankind trapped in a head-to-head battle between God and the devil. Now Anselm wanted to focus on Christ and his humanity. He even dared address questions of man's free will and how reason could be a meaningful part of faith. When he tries to understand why God took human form as Jesus, Anselm concludes that this was God's ultimate act of love, a gift to humanity, because he let his only son suffer torture and death so that we could be saved. Anselm thinks that this should be the true focus of Christian prayer and meditation. I've come to the British Museum in London to look at two extraordinary ivory carvings. The difference between the two objects shows what an effect Anselm's thinking would have. This is an important little object. It's an ivory carving dated to around 450 AD, and it shows a very early depiction of Christ on the cross. But what do we see? Well, Christ's legs are quite rigid. He seems to be standing on a platform, and his arms are straight out on the cross. He looks out at the viewer, and he's shown very youthful. He's not bearded here at all. What about the people around him? Well, you've got Mary and John here. They're not showing any sorrow. They're being quite stoic. So why is Christ shown on the cross in this way? Well, it's to show his divinity. Here, Christ isn't suffering. He's moving through death in order to achieve eternal life. He's triumphant. But Anselm pursued a faith that focused on the humanity of Christ, a shift in emphasis and understanding that would transform how art depicted Christ and how worshippers empathized with him. Another ivory of the same scene shows a very different picture. It's 14th century, probably carved in France, so well and truly in the Gothic period. And you can tell that from the architectural details that frame it. But something very different is going on with the crucifixion here. Christ is literally hanging from the cross. You can see his hands are pointing upwards, emphasizing that they're having to support his whole weight on just one nail. His head lolls over to one side. He doesn't make direct eye contact with the viewer anymore. And his legs bend over to one side too. He's very thin, almost skeletal. You can see the bones here in his elbows and even individual ribs in his rib cage. And this suffering is echoed by the figures around him. You can see the mourners, Mary and John. Mary's almost fainting with grief. So the viewer looking at this is being asked to empathize with this human suffering. Paris, one of the great sites of medieval pilgrimage. The faithful flocked here to honor an early martyr to the Christian cause, Saint Denis, a 3rd century bishop of Paris, beheaded for his faith. But the old church housing his shrine could not cope with the crowds of pilgrims. It was decided it must be rebuilt, and in a manner befitting France's premier saint. Gothic architecture was born. The head of the Abbey of Saint-Denis at the start of the 12th century was a man called Abbot Suger. Now, he was no meek and modest monk. He was a friend and advisor to two French kings. He was a statesman, a patron of the arts, and a poet.
Work began in 1140 to build a new choir attached to the old abbey church. Out went dismal and dark masonry. In came windows with glorious stained glass. Daring new pointed arches and ribbed roof vaults distributed the weight of stone much more skillfully than before, allowing wider spans, thinner, taller columns, and bigger windows. It was a new sense of light and space that would define not just a new style of architecture, but of faith too.
Suger had his own poetry inscribed around the church, and for the consecration of the new choir, he wrote, "The church shines with its middle part brightened, and bright is the noble edifice with this new light."
The new style would spread quickly, and shocking events across the Channel meant that Gothic would take a hold in England. Canterbury Cathedral in Kent. Peaceful today, but 8.5 centuries ago, the scene of the most infamous murder in British history. In 1170, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, was hacked to death in his own cathedral, murdered by a band of knights reputedly acting on the orders of the king. The Pope was quick to respond, and Becket was made a saint, transforming Canterbury into the most fashionable destination for pilgrims throughout Europe. So when fire destroyed the east end of the cathedral in 1174, it was clear something extraordinary had to replace it. A chapel fit for a murdered saint. Stained glass windows celebrating the life of Becket and his miraculous powers even after death are just one splendour of the massive rebuilding operation. One of the monks of Canterbury, Gervase, wrote an account of the work, which took 9 years to complete.
Gervase makes a really interesting comparison between the old Romanesque features and the new Gothic ones. So he talks about the piers there in the choir. He says that their length was increased about 12 feet. So he's stressing the new height of Gothic buildings. And then he describes some of the surface detail. He says the arches and everything else had been made flat, as though done with an axe. But here, in the new building, there is suitable chisel work on almost all things. So again, he's drawing attention to things like the chevrons, the decorated designs on the capitals. And the final point, he says, the walls between the transept and the choir are gone. Now they seem to meet in one keystone in the middle of the great vault. So gone is the array of columns that would obstruct the view of the choir in the old Romanesque church, and instead we have this wonderful open space. He concludes that all this, if one wishes to understand it, will be revealed more clearly by the sight of the church than by these words.
Gothic had arrived. Canterbury Cathedral could now claim both spiritual and architectural preeminence in the religious life of the nation. The language of Gothic, with its ever more daring pointed arches, the immense weight of its stone vaults, distributed downwards in ever bolder fashion. The carvers of this stonework were the great innovators of the medieval age, and here at Canterbury, they transformed the building into a miraculous reliquary for Becket's saintly remains. Next came Wells, with its sculpture-filled west front. The finest collection of medieval sculpture to adorn any building in England. It reminds us of how Gothic had often to rely on the pictorial in a largely illiterate medieval world. This front has been called a history of Christendom, with its figures stretching from Old Testament patriarchs to the missionaries who brought Christianity to England. Then came Lincoln, reputedly the tallest building in medieval Christendom, until its immense central spire collapsed in 1549. A reminder that Gothic masons were in the business of taking risks. But what a glorious interior! It's been called the most precious piece of architecture in the British Isles. Salisbury, with the highest surviving spire of any English cathedral, and its tall, skinny nave. Many medieval cathedrals took centuries to build, but Salisbury went up in 38 years. And then, of course, Westminster Abbey, a building of breathtaking grandeur. It was entirely rebuilt in the Gothic style, as the place of coronation and burial for English kings. Beginning with a spectacular new choir, which leads to the tomb of the only English king to be canonized, St. Edward the Confessor. Like so many great Gothic cathedrals, Westminster's soaring vaults were made possible by the inventiveness of the Gothic age, its engineering at a newly sophisticated level. On the exterior of the building, you can see so-called flying buttresses, which take the weight from above and skillfully distribute it beyond delicate walls, pierced by larger and larger windows. The flying buttress is a signature device of the medieval masons, allowing for more and more intricacy above, with less and less substance below. Stone tracery would grow ever more sophisticated as early Gothic gave way to a more elaborately decorated Gothic style. Tracery would dominate not just windows, but cover every available space. 3-leaf trefoils, 4-leafed quatrefoils, foliate carving everywhere, climaxing in extraordinary rose windows, another flourish in the high Gothic repertoire. By the beginning of the 14th century, Britain was a land populated by some of the finest Gothic cathedrals in Europe, but it was still largely an imported style. Now the scene was set for England to reinvent Gothic in a way that would leave the rest of Europe behind.
All Gothic architecture in the 12th and 13th centuries was inspired by France, and the tendency was for everything to become more and more elaborate, for the tracery and the carvings to become more intricate. But in the first half of the 14th century, something very dramatic happened. Work in England began to assert more simplicity that brought with it a greater sense of drama.
The invention of a new style would be provoked by yet another infamous murder. Edward II had been a disastrous king, defeated by the Scots and presiding over a divided England. In the end, his own queen conspired with the barons, and in autumn 1427, he was ignominiously murdered at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. The only religious institution prepared to take the body of the discredited king was the Abbey Church at nearby Gloucester. A spectacular high Gothic tomb was squeezed in between the old Romanesque columns of the Abbey Church. And soon, Gloucester became a major site of pilgrimage, as the memory of a hopeless king metamorphosed into one of tragic martyrdom. The growing cult of the martyred king was encouraged by his son and successor, Edward III.
Chance had made Gloucester the burial place of Edward's murdered father, and here was an opportunity for royal masons to realise a newly spectacular architectural setting for the dead king.
Edward III, who would reign for just over 50 years, was very different to his father. He had a bold vision for the kingdom. He would invent a new language of chivalry, cultivating the memory of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And invent England's first noble order of chivalry, the Order of the Garter. He even chose a new patron saint for the English, St. George. This was a king determined on an England that was a great power in Europe, a king who embraced a new nationalism and didn't want a second-hand architecture from France, but a new style, a national style.
Gone is the fussiness and the overemphasis on decoration. This is Gothic, pared down to its bare essentials, with a new confidence and daring in the engineering. So involved was the king with this project that he sent his own royal masons from London, over 100 miles away, for this architectural experiment.
The new style would come to be known as English Perpendicular. Stripped of the over-decoration that had characterised the previous century, the Perpendicular style would put the emphasis on clean, vertical lines, drawing the eye ever upwards. Walls were reduced to almost a grid pattern. The engineering ever bolder, and climaxing at Gloucester in the Great East Window, constructed in the 1350s. 72 feet high and 38 feet wide, it was the largest stained glass window of the age.
Here in this window, you get a sense of the changing religious thinking of the time, the way that the light brings the full-length figures to life. It really gives them a humanity, and the way that Christ is depicted there, looking down at the worshippers below, it's encouraging them to lift their eyes and their minds and their hearts up to Him.
Like the west front at Wells, the Great East Window at Gloucester can be read as a picture of medieval life and thought. Angels at the top, Mary and Christ in the centre, with the apostles to the side, other saints, kings, nobility, and bishops below. But here, the new architecture marries with a new theology to emphasise the humanity of Christ. Mary and Christ may be centrally placed, but they don't dominate the window. To the left of Mary, St. Peter holds a church signalling this is the Abbey Church dedicated to St. Peter. St. Cecilia, patron saint of music, faces a heroic St. George, symbol of England's enhanced sense of nationhood. Such was fear for the safety of Gloucester's precious window during World War II, its glass was entirely removed to safe storage. it remains a miracle of the age and a signpost to a new perpendicular future. Pascal Nicolaisen is head mason at Gloucester Cathedral.
Pascal, as a mason yourself, what would you describe as the sort of main features of English perpendicular Gothic?
Well, there are many things to say about it, but I think one of the starting point for me would be how different it is from the preceding Gothic style, which was coexisting with the perpendicular. It's a marked departure. It's a stylistic revolution. And if you look at the structure of the Cretis window, you've got a lot more horizontal and vertical division. It's a framework which is new.
Right, and having these horizontals and verticals allows for more glass, more space to let in light.
Yeah, more surface.
Right.
Yeah, because you've got a structure which is much more stable. And if you have a design which has so many vertical lines, you can, with a fairly modest height, suggest, by optical effect, a great height. And you can see it. It's much less than you have in Bourges or Amiens.
Yeah.
But you have this lofty feeling, and that's created by the design. Also, the perpendicular architecture is devoid of carving, and it's very much in contrast with the preceding period, which precisely is called decorated, because it's got exuberance of carving everywhere.
There's a contrast then with much more floreate detailing in the decorated style and this sort of linear form that perpendicular has. And why do you think it is that it develops this way? Why do the English develop this unique form of architecture?
For me, as a foreigner, I think what is very important, it is a manifestation in architecture of the birth of a nation. Because what you see in architecture, you can see it or read it in Chaucer's books. And it's Englishness being created.
And that's reflected, of course, in the fact that, the courtly language of French is being replaced by the English vernacular. So this is an architectural version of that, French decorated, replaced by English perpendicular.
To depart from the decorated is really to cut the ties.
Right.
And because the decorated has still many ties with the preceding architecture and the French influence. But now it's let's get rid of that. It's cut once for all.
And it's transformed into a very distinct and different looking space, isn't it?
Yes.
This is revolutionary architecture.
Yes, indeed. English Revolution.
Perhaps Gloucester's most striking feature is its remarkable tower. As masons became more and more adept at juggling the enormous downward thrust of stone, so the art of tall towers reached new heights.
That was such a climb. But what a view. Wow. The perpendicular tower here at Gloucester rises 225 feet into the air. And its crowning glory is up here. These beautiful pinnacles, they're open with these finely carved mullions. I think they're beautiful. In fact, I think that this tower is one of the most magnificent of all the Gothic cathedrals in England.
The medieval masons who built Gloucester married faith with mathematics and engineering. They were men of religion and reason. To get inside their minds is one of the most tantalizing puzzles of the Gothic age. Across the country, in Cambridgeshire, is Longthorpe Tower. the remaining fragment of a fortified manor house. And the site of some unique paintings.
This really is a hidden gem. The largest set of surviving medieval domestic wall paintings in Western Europe. They give really profound insight into Gothic lives and minds.
These paintings constitute an entire gallery of medieval preoccupations, build up a picture of the complex Gothic mind.
The Thorpe family that were responsible for these paintings have used these walls as canvases to express the things that were important to them, the things that concerned them. So over here you have the king balanced out with religious imagery like the Nativity and the saints. And on this side, a really unusual image of the Wheel of Five Senses. You've got reason in the centre, dressed as a king, and each of the senses is represented as a different beast. So the monkey represents taste, the vulture smell, the spider's web touch, the boar hearing, and the cock round here sight. This sort of symbolism could chime with an idea of medieval man as superstitious, wrapped up in a world of esoteric symbolism. But this is balanced out on the other wall by this image of Aristotle teaching. So we have book learning here, education factoring into these paintings.
Perhaps the most startling image is one you notice leaving the room, a reminder that while medieval craftsmen built for eternity, their own lives were often brief, and now death was about to deal the Gothic imagination a mighty blow.
Here we have an image from a popular medieval folk tale. The story goes that three princes encounter three dead men, shown here by these dark cadavers. At the climax of the story, the dead say to the living, "As we are, so shall ye be." These paintings date to around 1340, but in the next few years, the spectre of death was to cast a shadow of unprecedented scale across Europe.
In 1348, a disease arrived in England from Europe, where it had already wiped out half the population. The Black Death was spread by the fleas of rats. The agonizing boils were a portent of imminent death. It seemed like the arrival of Judgment Day itself. At Arundel Castle in Sussex, it's possible to see the Gothic imagination taking a darker turn.
This is the FitzAlan Chapel in Arundel, and it provides a focused view of attitudes towards life and death at the height of the Gothic period. Here's the tomb of John FitzAlan. He was a Knight of the Garter, and he fought for Henry VI in the 100 Years' War with France. His tomb monument is traditional in the way that a medieval knight would be commemorated after death. He's shown with all his symbols of social standing, his sword, his armour, his heraldry. But attitudes towards death in particular were changing. With the Black Death, there was an increasing sense that social status and wealth in this life were fleeting. How do you show that sort of intellectual change visually? Well, take a look down here. This is a transi-tomb, so it acts as a reminder of human mortality. Here we have the John FitzAlan again, but he's cadaverous. He's emerging from his burial shroud, naked and decaying. In some transy tombs, you'd even have rats nibbling at the body, or worms appearing to writhe underneath the surface of the skin. These gory images, part of the legacy, I think, of the macabre ideas underlying Gothic. There's no rats or worms here, but you can tell that he's supposed to be decaying because of the sunken cheeks, the hollowed out eye sockets, the fact you can count every rib, and the way he covers his withered modesty. But why does this monument look like this? Surely this decaying, ugly corpse literally undermines the gravitas of John Fitzalan. Well, it wouldn't have seemed strange at the time. What this tomb reflects is a gradual change in the minds of medieval men and women, accelerated by the effects of the plague.
The decimated nobility was reminded that they were as vulnerable as ordinary folk. The reduced peasantry grew all the more powerful because they were more sought after for their labour. Now, the Gothic world was beginning to look almost modern. Its religious framework was also less certain.
Without spiritual leaders for guidance, people had to see to their souls themselves. You can see this most clearly in the writings of the English mystics, men like Richard Roller, and women like Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp. They worked outside of the established church. They were social outcasts who sought through hallucination, starvation, and meditation a personal and almost physical understanding of Christ's sufferings and ecstasies.
The plague had shaken the spiritual foundations of the church, just as it would threaten the very bricks and mortar of the church, even causing the construction of Winchester Cathedral to come to a standstill for 25 years. But the Spartan nature of Perpendicular made it a robust architecture, even in a time of crisis. After the plague, with fewer masons around, architecture would grow sparser still, but to ever greater visual effect. The interior at Winchester, immense and soaring to the heights with its impressive vaulting. York Minster, a perpendicular choir, and a new great east window to rival Gloucester's. St Mary Redcliffe in Bristol, the most complete perpendicular interior in England. And the great octagonal lantern at Ely, a unique piece of construction that flowers upwards towards the heavens. The second half of the 14th century and the beginning of the 15th saw an explosion of perpendicular. England's first truly national style of architecture had arrived. Canterbury too was remodelled, and today the great perpendicular south window is undergoing restoration. Eroded stonework is being replaced with newly carved tracery. It's the work of Canterbury stonemason Emlyn Harris and his team.
So this is a diagram of what you guys are up to at the moment then?
Yeah, this is the drawing of the Great South Window. We're replacing all of the stonework from this point here to what we call a springing line. It's contentious, you know, there's a lot of people that don't feel comfortable with that amount of stone replacement. However, the priority is firstly to maintain a safe structure and keep the stained glass, you know, in a safe environment.
And everything in pink you've done?
Everything in pink's done.
Still a bit to go.
And there's still a little bit to go, yeah.
Talk me through the process. You start off with just a bare block.
Yep, it's a new stone. So Ben and Sam are checking the stone for the dimensions. They're checking it's square. Once they've done that, they'll then take the zinc template and they're going to scribe round that shape, and that is the shape that the finished stone needs to be.
Right. That becomes the core.
That becomes
and then you work out everything
stone.
else.
Yep.
Yeah. It looks like a very laborious process, but also I'm surprised how traditional the techniques they're using are.
Yeah, it's exactly the same way that stone has been marked up since the start of time. You know, the materials are slightly different. Instead of zinc templates, they would have had wooden templates. But still just a steel point and just scribe around the shape. This is Alan, and he's very close to finishing actually. You can see he's just sort of working through his last cavetto. There's not much in the way of carved decoration or anything like that. It's all about crisp, straight moulding.
How do you keep these straight lines? You're doing it all by hand.
Yeah, well, it's all about practice. It's about learning how to use the chisel sort of efficiently and repetitively. It's a conscious effort to follow your line.
And you can see from the sides that there's different curves going on here, aren't there?
That's right. The shape of the moulding can be achieved quite simply with just a change of chisel. We get all sorts of different tools. You know, that's just a simple bull nose, and that can be used for working your hollows.
And you've really got to think about these things in 3D, haven't you? You've got this template at the end, but it's this idea of it carrying all the way
exactly.
through.
One of the struggles with masonry that people can't really get their head around is you draw in 2 dimensions, but yet you apply all your templates in 3 dimensions.
So this looks like a much more complex piece.
This is one of the transom heads, which is one of the horizontal sort of tie pieces, if you like.
Supporting the windows above.
Yep.
It takes down below.
Takes a lot of the load.
So how long will it take you to work something? I mean, this looks so complicated. It must take ages.
The mason wants to be able to achieve something like that in round about 25 days.
Yeah, such highly skilled work. And there's something amazing about this, isn't it? That this is going to go back in to the medieval building. You're using the same techniques. It's going to become part of that story again.
The fact that stones are produced by stonemasons, you know, cathedrals, churches, they're all a celebration of craftsmanship. And, you know, we want to continue that.
Richard also put Gothic art to good use in a manual for royal coronations, known as the Liber Regalis, and referred to today as the Royal Book. The growing genius of Gothic illustrators and painters would contribute to a new sense of the divinity of kings. And Richard commissioned England's greatest surviving Gothic painting. The the Wilton diptych, an altarpiece that features the King with the infant Christ and Virgin Mary. The company of angels surrounding Mary defer to him, each wearing his personal emblem of the White Hart. It's one of the most exalted images ever made of an English king, on an altarpiece. Gothic art was becoming a means of personal communion with God, even if you weren't a cleric. An exquisite manuscript from the 1420s shows this vividly.
I'm at the British Library with a facsimile copy of the incredible Bedford Book of Hours, and it records an important event, the marriage of Henry V's brother, John, Duke of Bedford, to Anne of Burgundy. A Book of Hours was designed to be used and read by the noble patrons. It allowed them to emulate the cycle of prayers that monks followed, but unlike a community of monks, the readers of this volume could use it for private devotion. When you look at this image of Anne, you can see this emphasis on personal piety. She is in direct communion with the Virgin and Child. It's also interesting that at this time of a newly confident English court, the setting of heaven is surrounded by Gothic architecture. And when we come to the portrait of John, you can see that he is also in a private, personal communication, in this case with the patron saint of England, St. George. This object fascinates me because it brings together military commemoration, dynastic legacy, and personal piety. These sacred and secular ideas are all expressed in one object. It really shows the heights that Gothic art had reached.
The late genius of perpendicular meant that even small spaces achieved a feeling of elevation and light. And while architecture became ever more sophisticated, so the depiction of the human being became more rooted in reality.
This is the Beauchamp Chapel in Warwick. And from the second you cross the threshold, you get the sense that this is an intact Gothic space. There's all of the elements represented here. You've got architecture, sculpture, metalwork, stained glass, painting. They're all working together in harmony to commemorate one man, Sir Richard Beauchamp. He was one of the most important military and political figures of the 15th century. He died in 1439, but it would take another 20 years for his vision to be realised and for the chapel to be completed.
The central effigy of Sir Richard is the consummate Gothic figure, the formal image of a chivalric knight. At one level, a military man through and through, a career soldier who'd fought the Welsh and the French, but also a man of sensitivity and refinement. Sir Richard went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and was tutor to the infant King Henry VI. The effigy is life-sized.
It's made of gilt metal, and that's a medium usually reserved just for royalty. The whole chapel cost an absolute fortune to make, £2,481. And this monument alone cost 720. I'll put that into perspective. Richard's family paid 4 monks to pray for his soul every day for a year, and they only got £40. But the monument's not just lavish and beautiful, it's also important artistically. The lifelikeness of the hands and the face anticipate developments that we see later in the Renaissance. If you look at the vein on the temple, it almost pulses with lifeblood. There's a great sense of continuity and consistency in Perpendicular Gothic that I find surprising because the 15th century is such a turbulent time. There's great political turmoil, but places like this keep getting put up, and they're statements of permanence, stability, something lasting in a time of great change. As this chapel is being lovingly crafted, the wars of the roses are raging, and no one knows who's going to come out on top.
Of course, the victor was the clever and scheming Henry Tudor, shown here on the left, who, as Henry VII, founded a new royal dynasty that went on to give us Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, arguably a golden age in English history. It would also signal the end of the medieval age of Gothic. But not before one last flowering, possibly the most beautiful of them all. There is the magnificent rebuilding of St. George's Chapel at Windsor, home to the Order of the Garter. Then, the astounding Perpendicular of King's College Chapel in Cambridge, the largest fan-vaulted ceiling in the world, likened to the art of lace-making. And of course, the Henry VII Chapel at Westminster Abbey, built in the first half of the 16th century. Few great art moments in history have dominated the fabric and sensibility of a nation for as long as Gothic. But Gothic architecture, which had put so much emphasis on structure and engineering, would begin to stray from its original integrity. For all its gravity-defying brilliance, the ceiling in the Henry VII Chapel departs from the previous genius of medieval masons.
The fan-vaulted ceiling here is a masterpiece, but it is a flawed one. Traditionally, the fan would spring out of the top of the pier at the side of the wall, but here there are pendants set 2 meters in from the wall, and the fan appears to be springing out of those. Now that's impossible, they're not supported by anything. It creates this gravity-defying illusion, but there's this arch that seems quite incongruous, breaking up the apsidal end from the nave. It really does upset the flow of the ceiling. It comes directly between 2 of the pendants. Seems it's here because while the building was being constructed, the masons had to almost make it up as they were going along. They must have felt that the ceiling needed additional support at that point.
And if the ceiling above seems to signal the end of an era, so does the monument below. The impressive tomb of Henry VII and his queen, Elizabeth of York, is a significant departure from the Gothic.
It was commissioned by Henry VII's son, Henry VIII, and made by the artist Torrigiano, who's credited as having brought the Renaissance style to the English for the first time. We can see that not just in the beautiful surface decoration and the figures around the tomb, but also in the details of the effigies of Henry VII and Elizabeth. This tomb heralds the dawning of a new era.
Torrigiano's figures signalled a new age of realism. The figures of Henry and Elizabeth look domestic rather than chivalrous and courtly. The fluid movement in the fabric of their clothes replaces the straight and formal lines of Gothic sculpture. Cuddly cherubs sit alongside the more usual heraldic beasts. But the real blow to Gothic would come in the form of the English Reformation. Henry VIII made himself head of the church in England, overturning the authority of the Pope. It would herald an age of vandalism against Gothic art and sculpture, the language of the Catholic Church. Sacred paintings of saints would be scratched out, sculptures smashed. The great monastic institutions were abolished. Gothic architecture survived, but often ruinous and denuded of detail. And with a new reverence for the remains of ancient Rome, classical architecture, with its symmetry and sense of rigid proportion, would become fashionable. At the Palace of Hampton Court, Gothic fabric and classical detail even competed for the upper hand. Eventually, classicism would win out, dominating English culture for 300 years. The Gothic age, above all the genius of Perpendicular, England's first national style, seemed to be over. But it wasn't quite the end of the story.
We tend to traditionally think of Gothic ending with Henry VIII. During his long and turbulent reign, the classically inspired Renaissance style that had grown up in Italy set down roots firmly in England. But history is fluid. There's rarely a moment where people unanimously wake up one day and think, oh, that's the end of one era and the beginning of another. There's always evolution and development. Gothic evolves and develops. True, events like the Reformation and the Enlightenment knock it off its pedestal as the defining architectural style of the high medieval period. But when Augustus Pugin and Charles Barry sought a new architecture of power and national pride for the Houses of Parliament, they returned to Gothic because English Perpendicular Gothic was the physical setting for the birth of England as a nation.